and this is the first time I've ever shared this story I'm about to tell you. Sometimes, in the still of the night, it runs through my head on a loop. So I feel the time's come to put it out there and hope that certain demons can be laid to rest. It all started with a dare, like many unspeakable things do. I mean, when Gemma and I initially took up the challenge to stay in the old Cantor house overnight, it's not as though we hadn't heard of all the stories about the Scuttler. We just didn't worry too much about them. Girls of logic, that's what we were, and no amount of crazy stories could shock us or put us off. That's not to say that the old house wasn't spooky in its own way. It had been abandoned years previously and, as with all empty, decaying houses, it had an air of melancholy about it that wasn't entirely pleasant, but certainly didn't appear threatening or otherworldly in any other way. Well, I'm sure you know how it is. A group of university friends sitting around after an evening of events, bathed only in the glow of blossom-scented candles, tanked up on a little too much wine and up way past their bedtimes. Naturally, the conversation turned to ghosts and ghouls and all the other rubbish that people like to talk about when a good spine-chilling session is in order. It was Roger who first introduced the topic of the Scuttler, and not for the first time either. Ever since we had taken up residence in our own house in the second year of our degrees, Roger had shown a keen interest in the subject, not least because we lived almost opposite the old house. It wasn't an obsession exactly, more of a vague amusement combined with a certain degree of what I'd believe. So, once again, he broached the subject on the night in question. The assembled company groaned audibly when the topic of the Scuttler was raised, with Gemma, stubbing out a cigarette with a bored yawn, grumbled, "Here we go again." "No, but really," said Roger, "it's such an odd story that it could almost be real." "Yeah, almost, but not quite," I said. "That is the point of these things. It's unbelievable when, even underneath it all, you know they can't be true or 90% of it is made up." "I agree," said Sophie. "It's like that stupid story about the man who hammered a nail through his penis for a thrill, split it open, poured Coke over it to stop the bleeding, and then passed out." "So what's unusual about that?" "Anybody would pass out if they just split open their most prized possession," commented Roger. "No, that's not the end," continued Sophie. "Apparently he came round hours later, and when he looked down at his lunchbox, and by that, I mean the entire ensemble, it had been entirely eaten away. It's said that rats were attracted by the smell of Coke, and had gnawed the whole of his tackle away." "That's absolute nonsense," laughed Gemma. "Well, you don't know for certain," said the ever-believing Roger. "It is such nonsense," Gemma giggled. "Everybody knows rats don't drink Coke. They only like Pepsi." "You can joke about it all you want," grumbled Roger, "but I wouldn't dismiss it so lightly if I were you. And I wouldn't dismiss the tale about the Chandler house either." "Why not?" Gemma said. "It's not like I ever have a cause to visit the place. It really doesn't affect my life one bit." "Yes, and I'll bet you never would visit the place either," said Roger, in a tone which indicated he thought he'd proved his point. "Well, I don't need to visit it, so I probably never would, but I wouldn't be scared to." Roger held Gemma's gaze steadily for a full minute before licking his lips, raising an eyebrow and challenging her to prove it. Gemma, brave as ever, lit up a new cigarette, inhaled deeply and told Roger that, if that was all she needed to prove that it was a crock of shit, she'd be perfectly willing to do so. But only on the understanding that, after she'd spent a full night there, he would never raise the subject of the Scuttler again. Feeling it unfair to allow Gemma to go on her own, and eager to prove Roger wrong, I offered to take up the challenge with her, and so it was that we prepared ourselves to spend a full night in the shadow of the Scuttler the following weekend. So perhaps now is the time to fill you in on the story of the Scuttler. Legend has it that the house was inhabited by the Chandler family in the early 90s. The said family consisted of a mother, a father, and two of the most gorgeous children you could ever hope to meet. A blue-eyed, blonde-haired dream of a girl and her strikingly handsome brother who, at 10 years old, couldn't do enough for his younger sister. Life jogged along in a merry old fashion for the Chandler family, with all the obligatory visits to the zoo and Disney World and skiing holidays in the Alps during school holidays. Life was fine and merry for the family. Merry that was, until one summer morning in 2000, when 9-year-old Rosa was playing in the driveway of the house, jumping from square to square on the hopscotch board that she had chalked onto the gravel. She was so engrossed in her game, long blonde hair swinging like a golden sheet in the sun, that she only registered the sound of the car when it was inches away from her. Frozen to the spot, she was unable to move quickly before the car reversed over her, crushing both legs in the process. Hearing her screams, Mrs. Chandler came rushing out of the house, to be greeted by the view of her daughter trapped beneath the wheels of her husband's car, covered in blood and convulsing violently. Her beloved son sat in the driver's seat, hands still gripping the steering wheel from which he had reversed it out of the garage. After that, the Chandlers' lives changed considerably. Young Rosa had both of her legs amputated above the knee and spent the rest of her childhood in a wheelchair. But apparently, that wasn't all. In the time it takes to reverse a car, poor young Charles had gone from being the hero of Rosa's childhood to being an antichrist, heart filled with a burning rage. Rosa began to create ways to make her brother's life a nightmare. Hell-bent on vengeance, she would terrorize him in every way she knew how. And knowing that he hated the sight of her useless stumps, she refused to learn to wear the prosthetic limbs the doctors had made for her, and insisted on making her brother come face to face on a daily basis with the results of his actions. Of a night, Rosa would roll out of her bed and, using her arms to move, would scuttle towards Charles' room where she proceeded to inflict her own injuries on him. When Charles' mother commented on the cuts and bruises that had suddenly started to appear on his body, he remained silent or told her that he had simply tripped, fearing the newfound power of the little girl who plagued his every waking moment. Of a night, he would lay rigid in his bed, ears straining for the telltale scuttling sound that marked his vengeful sibling's approach. Like all good victims, Charles continued to keep quiet, which, in the end, was the biggest mistake of his life. In fact, it was the last mistake of his short little life. In the wee small hours of a cold winter morning, some 18 months after the accident, 10-year-old Rosa sneaked into her brother's room for the last time, wielding a large steak knife, which she had gotten from the kitchen earlier that day. Rosa set about cutting her brother into small pieces. She ripped so much flesh out of his body that, by the time she was finished, the knife was allegedly blunt, and there was barely an inch of the room that wasn't covered in blood. And now here's where the story starts to get really silly. Having done away with her brother in the most grotesque manner, Rosa scuttled away and, squeezing her small body through an old service hatch in the wall, disappeared into the dark crawl space of the house, never to be seen again. Except, of course, on the odd occasion that an unwitting tramp decided to bend down in the abandoned Chandler house, when Rosa would put in an appearance, never getting any older, mind, and scuttle over and slash the poor old bugger to death. I mean, have you ever heard of such nonsense in your life? Anyway, armed with a few bottles of wine and an emergency supply of chocolate that would have sent a dietitian into a fit, and a carrier bag of large candles, plus a strong torch and a few blankets, Gemma and I crept into the abandoned Chandler residence. Belief or no belief in spooky tales, it wasn't a pleasant place. In fact, it was rank. It stunk of years of decay, and you couldn't tread on a floorboard without making some form of protest. Yuck. Remind me why we're doing this again? Said Gemma, untangling a cobweb from her long, fair hair. Usually in pristine condition, I wondered how long it would be before it started looking a bit ratty from all the dust in the house. Don't go blaming me, you agreed to it, I reminded her, delving into the carrier bag and lighting a few candles. After a quick rescue of the place, armed with our trusty torch, everything appeared to be Scuttler-free and rather normal. Well, as normal as you could expect. Coming down the stairs, my legs gave way slightly and Gemma reached down and grabbed roughly at my sleeve in order to save me plummeting headfirst on the wooden staircase. Christ, be careful, she said, a flutter of concern in her voice. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said, brushing her off and reclaiming my sleeve. You know what a clumsy cow I am, and these moldy old stairs don't help much. You're too bloody clumsy if you ask me, responded Gemma huffily, and then her face broke into a mischievous smile as she reminded me of the time I had tripped over and landed face down in Roger's birthday cake. Well, this is fun, I said after a while. Sure is, Gemma replied, breaking open a bar of Cadbury's fruit and nut and taking a huge bite. I sort of wish we'd never agreed to it now, she said around a mouthful of chocolate. We could always go back. Oh, right, and have Roger laugh at us for being cowards. He'd never believe it was just because we missed our creature comforts. No, I reckon we've got to stay. We'll never hear the last of his Scuttler stories. So saying, we'd settled down into a companionable silence. Of sorts. The silence bit was total, but the companionable part was a little questionable. Gemma and I, although we used to get along fantastically, were still reasonably good friends, had experienced problems in the past. A long story of her nabbing a tall, hunky postgrad that I'd had my eye on for months. Although we made it up in the end, things have never been quite as rosy between us. It was during times like this that I always feared she would bring it up again. Silent, all girls together times which generated topics of conversation that I just couldn't deal with. That was not my way to talk problems out, and I hoped that she wouldn't raise the subject that night, because I knew myself well enough to be certain that it would work me up into a temper again. And then, where would we be? Back to square one, with the disagreeable atmosphere in the house and people tiptoeing around us. As bad luck would have it, Gemma managed to last a whole 15 minutes, roughly the amount of time it took her to polish off a Mars bar and half a Kit Kat, before she mentioned the hunky post-grad. Look, Emily, she began, twisting a strand of hair around her index finger. I just want to let you know how sorry I am about all that business with Adam. Don't mention it. Don't mention it. I responded mildly, trying to stop her before she got going. It's just that I feel bad about it. Really, don't mention it, I said, cutting her off and hoping she would take the hint. No such luck. For the next half an hour I was subjected to the spectacle of Gemma's guilt. On and on she went until, at about 1:30, we heard a scuttling sound from above. Both of us froze and I immediately strained my ears to try and catch the sound. And then it came again. A slow, scraping sort of noise like a sack, or a very small body being dragged across the floor. You don't think it's the Scuttler, do you? Hissed Gemma, her eyes wide with fear. I doubt it very much. It's just a story, I replied. Nevertheless, it certainly sounded like someone was up there. The noise continued, moving over our heads and then making its way slowly down the stairs. Bump, scrape. Bump, scrape. Gemma and I stared at each other, mouths slack with fear. Licking my lips, I heard the noise approach the lounge and shrunk back into the shadows. It couldn't be the Scuttler. I mean, it was just a story, right? A pile of crap. But nevertheless, something was in there with us. Suddenly the door banged open and Gemma and I screeched, grabbing each other in a fear-induced embrace as an old tramp lumbered in, a half-finished bottle of gin hanging limply in his hands. What are you doing here? He slurred as his glassy eyes tried to focus on us. Gemma and I, still catching our breath, were unable to answer. Bloody trespassers. I bet you're looking out for the Scuttler, he said, and he giggled manically. Well, I hope she's finishes. He scowled, and with that, he shuffled out of the house, letting the front door bang loudly behind him. Gemma and I looked at one another, and then her blue eyes crinkled into a smile and she started to laugh in relief, lightening the atmosphere somewhat until, that is, she insisted on raising the issue of Adam again 5 minutes later. By 2:30, I was in blind rage with her. The girl didn't know when to drop an issue, and above us, the floorboard creaked again and something scuttled in the murky depths of one of the rooms. Probably just a rat, I thought. I tried to convince myself that Scuttler didn't exist anymore. Perhaps it had never existed, but as Gemma flicked back her long, blonde hair and surveyed me with cool blue eyes that knew too much, I instantly sensed that the Scuttler was among us. Hidden all those years, she'd been right there without me even realizing. As Gemma's eyes looked fearfully at the point just beyond my shoulder, as though assessing the chance of escape in the presence of the damned, I felt the hair on the back of my neck arise, and a cold chill filled the hollow of my stomach. Suddenly there was blood everywhere. Before I knew what had happened, there was a snapping sound inside of my head. And maybe it was one of Gemma's bones because, in that instant, Gemma was being torn to pieces. I watched the whole thing as though standing outside of myself. I saw the gelatinous, viscid gore that eased out of her body and matted her hair. The gluttonous pop of her eyeballs made as they were ripped apart in the shot, rictus grin that her mouth made as she realized the truth, and through it all, the shadow of the Scuttler hung over us, terrifying me more than anything ever had before, driving me into a demented, petrified panic. And then, I was running along the pavement with all my might, as I sought to gain the sanctuary of my own house on the other side of the street and outrun the specter of the Scuttler. Twice, I stumbled and I fell, and twice I clambered unsteadily to my feet, looking behind me at the House of Horrors, before I lurched forward again towards the warm lights of a student house. Screeching through the door, I was met by the aghast faces of my friends as I told them something. I knew not what, but something unearthly had attacked Gemma. Unable to stop them, I watched as they ran across the road towards the old Chandler house, and slowly, I ascended the stairs and I made for the quietness of my own room. Once there, I surveyed myself in the mirror. Quite a lot of Gemma's blood had made its way onto my fair hair, tinging it with ruby red highlights. As I sat down on the bed, I contemplated once again the strange myth that had attached itself to the house. I thought, as I ran my hand over my aching thighs, how people like to exaggerate, how things get changed over the years, as if a small girl would refuse to use the artificial limbs, preferring to scuttle around, as if a girl would beat and bruise her brother, and then think that she would kill him and slip away forever into the bowels of a house, leaving there even after it was long abandoned. No, that would never happen. A girl would run to her parents, confess what she had done, but they would understand. Her brother had taken away her life, and in turn, she had exacted her revenge, but not in a gory display, just with one swift motion of the knife, one exact, precise thrust into the heart of her once-loved sibling. And surely, too, she would be given proper psychiatric care, allowing her, eventually, to live a normal life. Yes, apart from the occasional bout of anger, her life would be normal, almost boringly normal. Perhaps she would even go to a university and try to get herself a degree, change her name, and at some point, forget the past, just so long as people stopped stirring up that buzzing nest of anger in the pit of her stomach. Yes, though, as I bent down and ran my hands over the length of my artificial legs that I had become so adept at using over the past 10 years that, apart from the odd bouts of clumsiness, nobody would ever guess that I wore them. That's the way it would happen. I should know because that's the way it did happen.